Hello, welcome to another episode of Death Drive Dialectics. Today we're honored to have on as our guest Dr. Gerald Horne, an esteemed historian of American, African, and colonial history, author of some of our favorite books on these topics, including the Counterrevolution of 1776, the Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism series, and White Supremacy Confronted. And finally, a professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston. We've invited Dr. Horne because we find that no one speaks as clearly on the historical roots of race and capitalism and the colonization of Africa and the Americas. Dr. Horne's work has a lot to teach us about how the violent domination and exploitation of our colonial past, the US's colonial past in particular, impacts our lives today. So we're hoping through a discussion of whiteness, colonial history, and capitalist exploitation to map a clear through line between the 15th century all the way to the present. But without further delay, we'll get into the interview.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about from reading your books, especially your series on the Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, was about the development of whiteness. I think you did a really good job of unpacking the social construction of whiteness and its material base. So I want to ask you, what is whiteness and how did it develop politically and economically? And how has settler colonialism shaped its development?
Well, I would begin to say thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. And I would also add that this construction of this identity politics of whiteness is a relatively recent historical development, as W.E. Du Bois, amongst others, have pointed out. As I tell the story, it is seated minimally in the 16th century in the context of religious conflicts between His Catholic Majesty and Spain, who had a first mover's advantage in light of the fact that in 1492, España had sponsored the freebooter known as Christopher Columbus, who had encountered the Americas, and that led to depredations inflicted upon the indigenous population, not to mention untold wealth. London, as you know, had broken away from the one true faith, speaking of Catholicism, following the lead of Martin Luther, who approximately in 1517 helped to inaugurate what was then known as the Protestant sect. London, amongst other powers, went in on the colonial feast that had enriched España so tremendously. And to that end, it had begun to expropriate the interests of the Catholics in the Sceptred Isles as it embarked on the path of Protestantism. That unleashed a round robin of religious wars, not only encompassing London and in particular, but also Spain to a certain degree. A sub-theme of my work has been the torturous history of the French Huguenots, the French Protestants, who were massacred quite in a quite bloodthirsty fashion, circa 1572. In any case, what happens is that London, being under the gun, after all, they were outnumbered tremendously by the Catholics, began to improvise. And it had stumbled upon the idea that it could incorporate those with whom it had been warring, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, in this new identity politics of whiteness that, of course, takes place in the context of London itself barely escaping being toppled in 1588 by forces spearheaded by His Catholic Majesty. Only a shift in the winds, at least metaphorically, saved the British crown. And it turns out that that was the winning ticket, because as I talk about with regard to the, quote, settling, unquote, of what we now call Florida in 1565 and thereabouts, stretching across the straits into Cuba, you see that His Catholic Majesty tended to privilege the arrival of Catholic settlers, which, of course, looking retrospectively, was not wise if one wanted to embark successfully upon a settler colonial project. Improvisationally, London has stumbled upon this concept of whiteness, incorporating various European ethnic groups. And then, over the decades, if not centuries, that remit being expanded to include Egyptian Christians, including Arab Christians. For example, the man we know as Ralph Nader comes from a Lebanese Christian family. As far as I know, he's been inducted into the Hallowed Halls of Whiteness, for example. And so this was important for the development of settler colonialism, particularly in what we now call the United States of America, because what we have also come to realize is that the United States had its hands full in terms of uprooting the indigenous population, because the indigenous population had within its ranks many skilled warriors. For example, the Comanches of Texas. I'm now looking at what we now call the U.S. Pacific Northwest. And the United States had a tremendous problem in conquering that vast territory, not only because of the martial skills of the Cayuse and the Walla Walla in particular, but also across the border was the Hudson Bay Company in what we now call Canada. And the United States and the settlers were charging that the Hudson Bay Company was actually arming the indigenous population, not to mention the fact that under the jurisdiction of the Crown across the border in what we now call Canada were these fearsome, quote, Northern Indians, unquote, who would descend upon what we call Seattle in boats 100 feet long and then massacre all the settlers. And then, of course, there were the Russians to contend with further north in what we call Alaska. And so, to sum up, we find, A, that this construction of whiteness in many ways is a class collaborationist project, and that helps to explain, for example, what many have difficulty understanding, which is how and why Mr. Trump got 77 million votes in November 2024, and despite all manner of misdeeds, including marching along the perilous path of neo-fascism, he does not seem to be slated for dislodging from office anytime soon. And I would also say that with regard to this class collaborationist project, and I make this point in my book on Texas, and I'll make it again on this book on the so-called Pacific Northwest, is that a lot of the energy for uprooting the indigenous population really comes from the settler grassroots. Because after all, they were on the front lines. They had the difficult task of holding the ground, holding the Native American ground in the face of Native American offensives. And then, of course, many in the U.S. military who were also slated to slaughter the indigenous were sometimes leery and wary, charging into battle with the indigenous, but then they were being prodded by the settler grassroots. And that helps to explain this really epical evolution of class collaboration, which, as I've said elsewhere, is the highest form of white supremacy, just like white supremacy is the highest form of class collaboration.
That's so fascinating, and I think that what you said about this tension between settlers on the very front lines and the military, we see that, so much in the treaties with the indigenous, of like the military, in particular the British, suing for peace and the settlers pushing for war. In many ways, it reminds me of Israel Palestine, and the ways in which the settlers are at the sort of spear's tip of pushing for annexation.
We really need a book, and you gentlemen seem to be much younger than myself, and so I'll pass the task along. But what you just said really needs exploration at book length. Maybe it's already been done and I'm just not familiar with it. In terms of the history of settler colonialism in the United States of America, how repeatedly London is being charged with being in alliance with the indigenous. I mean, after all, look at the War of 1812, for example, where Tecumseh, the great Native American hero, dies fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Redcoats, for example. And we all know, at least even before my work, it was well known that the enslaved Africans, uh, by several orders of magnitude, did not support the revolt against the crown in 1776, which goes a long way to explain why our community has been pulverized and tortured so horrifically over the centuries because of our reluctance to engage in class collaboration, uh, which, of course, is something that is not necessarily rewarded in this white supremacist state. And so we really need further exploration of this, and it will point us, I think, into a principle that many radicals, at least on the surface, subscribe to, which is that if you look at the history of Black people in light of what I've just outlined, you cannot understand how we've been able to escape the snares of slavery and Jim Crow without understanding the international situation, without understanding international solidarity, for example, starting with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignites a general crisis of the entire slave system, which can only be resolved with its collapse, which prods and helps to energize British abolitionists, who then in turn are able to influence London to move away from the African slave trade circa 1807, and then to abolish slavery itself circa 1833, 1834, whereby, of course, it takes a bloody civil war involving the slaughter of hundreds of thousands in order to abolish slavery on these shores. So as we smell the odor of fascism wafting into our nostrils, is well past time to begin to try to construct a new story, a story that moves away from the romanticizing of the past, a story which in many ways is really just a surrender and a capitulation to the right wing, which I'm afraid to say has been the stock and trade of many liberals. After all, they helped to bring into motion the Red Scare, whereby they joined enthusiastically on routing those to their left. I'm speaking of the AFL-CIO, the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, just to name three amongst those groups that have survived the Red Scare. And now, of course, you have pundits talking about the Blue Scare, where Mr. Trump says that the Democratic Party is actually a party of radical extremists who need to be crushed, including their donors, like the billionaire George Soros. So clearly, we need a new story, but it'll be up to folks like yourselves to write that story.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we do need new stories, that there are a lot of comforting myths that American mythology has wrapped itself in ideologically that serve this function of obfuscating the brutality and the violence of capitalist extraction and imperialism. There's one thing that you said that I wanted to go back to because I think it's such an important point to highlight. I think so many people think of racism and white supremacy as this exclusivist ideology of excluding people, casting people out. And while it certainly is that, I think what I like about your work is that you highlight the ways in which racism can be inclusive and the sort of pan-Europeanism of racism, that racism isn't, just this problem, but came as the solution to this religious contradiction and this, national contradiction. Um, and so I
Yeah.
always think that's a really important thing to highlight because I think that that's a big part of the MAGA movement is this inclusive racism of let's expand the tent of who can be racist and who's in this in group in a period of crisis.
Yeah, I thought if you have anything to say
No,
to
go
that,
ahead. Go ahead.
right? I thought one of the most uh, compelling concepts in your Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism series was how the divisions of religion, particularly between Protestant and then Catholicism and even Judaism, were superseded by a kind of religion of whiteness, or this pan-Europeanism, which came to allow these various sects to collaborate with each other. And I'd like to back up for a second. And another thing I found particularly interesting was the Jewish diasporic communities that featured prominently in your book.
Mm.
And if you can elaborate on some of the connections between anti-Semitism and the whiteness, which came to underlie the particularly successful settler colonial states. I mean, if you talk about the Reconquista or the Inquisition in Spain, and how anti-Semitism or rampant anti-Semitism was, perhaps as you would put it, unwise in certain situations.
Unwise indeed. It
Yeah.
wasn't the winning ticket. I mean, although, let me skip ahead to
Hmm.
2025. One of the things
Please.
I've been pointing out recently is that we may be experiencing the decomposition of US imperialism. And just as in contemporary Japan, there are cells of more adult diapers than baby diapers, which is an expression of decomposition. I find it rather curious that at this stage, the United States is not only in sharp conflict with Venezuela, which is threatening to invade, tightening the blockade against Cuba, threatening to bomb Mexico, conflicts with the former realm of His Catholic Majesty in Spain. That is to say, Spain has a socialist government under Prime Minister Sanchez, and has come into conflict with the Trump regime because of a reluctance to spend a certain percentage of GDP on the military, which in substance means sending a check across the Atlantic to the US military industrial complex, for example. So in some ways, you've had a return to the seamy and grimy origins of what used to be called Anglo-American imperialism. That is to say, with the conflict with the Spanish-speaking world, for example. And I haven't even talked about the Supreme Court authorizing racial profiling against U.S. nationals of Mexican ancestry. They're just going to have to tough it out, as Mr. Trump told women who are pregnant who want to take Tylenol. You're just going to have to tough it out. I mean, this is just the way things are right now. But to return to your point, and I think it is connected, Spain, understandably and justifiably, has been denounced for the Inquisition and its rampant anti-Jewish fervor. But as I point out in my book on the 16th century, in many ways they're preceded by England. As Professor Heng, Heng, Professor Heng's work tells us, you have the expulsion of the Jewish population as early as the 13th century, for example. Interestingly enough, in today's Wall Street Journal, that is to say October 4th, 2025, in a story about the recent despicable attack in Manchester on the Jewish community of Great Britain, it's mentioned not only that the Jewish population is 0.04% in Great Britain, but also, according to the Wall Street Journal, the expulsion was driven by a desire to expropriate the Jewish community, an expropriation driven by the crown and by nobles, for example. But and that points to another case, which I oftentimes think about in talking about the United States. It reminds me of President Obama when dealing with so-called terrorists. The idea was incineration, not incarceration, because when you liquidate a population, oftentimes, or expel a population altogether, oftentimes there are not voices rising subsequently to denounce and castigate what transpired. And I think that if you look at the history of the Jewish population in the North Atlantic, particularly in London, you get a glimpse of what I'm mentioning. But in any case, with the evolution of whiteness, you begin to see the incorporation of the Jewish population into the hallowed halls of whiteness. As I oftentimes tell my classes, Judah P. Benjamin, who of course is viewed as the brains of the Confederacy, a high-level official in Louisiana, of course, was Jewish, had roots in not only the Virgin Islands, but also South Carolina. And interestingly enough, Edward Blyton, who oftentimes is viewed as the father of Pan-Africanism, he also has roots in a Jewish neighborhood in the Virgin Islands that actually produced Judah P. Benjamin. For you football fans in the audience, U.S. football, you may be familiar with the running back of the Baltimore Ravens, Derrick Henry. He has roots in Yulee, Florida, named after a Jewish senator from slave-owning Florida, Senator Yulee, Y-U-L-E-E. Now, to be sure, despite the rise of many Jewish men into the highest ranks of white supremacy and capitalism, and even slave owning in the United States of America, that does not mean that anti-Jewish fervor is eradicated. I was telling my class the other day about the curious case of Leo Frank, the Jewish man who's lynched in Georgia more than a century ago, which helps to encourage many Jewish elites to fund the NAACP, for example, as an antidote to lynching. What's interesting about the Leo Frank case is not only this exemplar of blood libel, insofar as, well, he's being accused of killing Christians for reasons that I'm sure you'll be able to infer. But interestingly enough, one of the key witnesses against him was a black man who Leo Frank and his comrades were charged. They were charging this black guy with committing the killing of Mary Fagan, the Christian girl. And that gives you an idea of the depths of anti-Jewish fervor in the United States at the same time that you have certain Jewish men being inducted into the halls of whiteness. To the point in 2025 where you see that many Zionist billionaires or some of the closest supporters of Mr. Trump, as he is oftentimes quick to note, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is Jewish. We need not bring up William Ackman of Manhattan or the family that owns the Dallas Mavericks basketball team and Las Vegas, and in fact, Chinese casinos in Macau, that is also simultaneously a supporter of Mr. Netanyahu. And of course, the fact that Mr. Trump and the right wing are now wielding the Jewish question like a cudgel and battering the left on charges of being anti-Semitic, because many of the left rise to the defense of the Palestinians, which really is another way of saying that they're trying to make sure that the settler colonialism that swept across North America in the 19th century and left within its wake victims of genocide is not extended to the 21st century, for example. But of course, you have those who say that those who are resisting this onslaught of settler colonialism in historic Palestine are no more than bigots, for example, led by Mr. Trump. And of course, to quote a short story from my early education, they're willing to burn down the house to roast the pig. That is to say, they're willing to wound severely, to put it euphemistically, one of the crown jewels of this country, which is the higher education sector, on these spurious charges of anti-Semitism. In other words, they're willing to circumscribe, if not deny, funding to cancer research, Alzheimer's research that takes place at universities like Harvard and Columbia, on the spurious charge that these universities are hotbeds of anti-Jewish fervor. I don't think you'll be able to understand what is going on today without some previous understanding of anti-Semitism stretching back to London 800 years ago.
Yeah, I think the one of the reasons that I appreciated particularly the Dawn of Settler Colonialism book was because of because it's a complicated question, this teeter-tottering between and confluence of anti-Semitism and including Jewish populations into, as what you described, the Hall of Whiteness. And today in contemporary politics or geopolitics, and especially considering, what's happening in Palestine and Gaza, I think a lot of people refuse to acknowledge whiteness as a category of exploitation and settling, especially in Palestine, that the Jewish population, in a sense, is operating as in the vein of a white settler colonial state, and again, charging people who make this point as bigots is something that definitely needs, I think, a different story which acknowledges the past as you're describing. And if more people read your Dawn of
I think
Settler Colonial book, that would be better.
if I could add one thing, I think that like what's so difficult to acknowledge for so many is this contradiction that
Yeah.
the Jewish population as a ethnic group, as a population, has experienced a sort of conditional whiteness at times, experiencing intense anti-Semitism, experiencing all the horrors that come with imperial systems, violence, genocide, expropriation, persecution across countries and across continents. And at times when conditions change, have had a share in some of this exploitation, and in that groups can occupy these contradictory roles. And I think that the narratives that are pushed forward are simplistic because they can't acknowledge this contradiction. One thing,
And of course, sadly enough, we all have to be careful nowadays because, as opposed to the idea that you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free, the mantra in the United States is that if you speak the truth, you might wind up in jail, you might lose your job, you might get shot at, etc. So, you
yeah.
know, I've lived a full life, but you gentlemen have many years before you, as I see it. So I don't want to sound like a school teacher, but be careful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are very aware of the dangers that come with talking like this. I mean, yeah, it's definitely scary times.
It's a topic that requires nuance. One thing that I wanted us to talk about, that I thought was another aspect of your writing in general, that I just absolutely love, is the way in which you constantly highlight and uphold the extent to which enslaved Africans and indigenous people resisted the
Hmm.
colonization and enslavement that they were subjected to. I think
Hmm.
oftentimes in history, the enslaved and the indigenous are seen as passive victims of this, horrible force, if that is even mentioned at all. And I think what I like about your work is that you insist on this point, that like what has shaped the conditions of colonization and exploitation was this fierce resistance. And so I wanted
Hmm.
to just to hear you talk a bit about the resistance and how that shaped capitalism and colonization, particularly here in the U.S. and in the Americas.
Well, as I intimated a few moments ago, I just returned from another research trip to the Pacific Northwest, although I thought it was my last trip, but my visit to the regional branch of the National Archives in Seattle was interrupted by the government shutdown. So
Mm.
here you see at least an aspect of what that brings, which, of course, I'm not in any way challenging the opposition party for participating in this. But that brings me to Oregon, for example. And as you probably know, Oregon, as it was taking off as a settler entity in the 1840s, they sought to ban Negroes, for example. Now, of course, many of our naive friends on the left, they interpret that as being anti-slavery and somehow progressive. But actually, they were worried that the Negroes would align with the aforementioned fearsome indigenous populations to interrupt settlement. I'm speaking of the Cayuse, for example, Cayusc, in particular, to the point where even today, Portland, a major U.S. city, has one of the smaller populations of Black people, stemming back to those decisions in the 1840s, for example. And I think I mentioned this in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, that in devising these anti-Negro provisions, the founding fathers of settler colonialism in Oregon were looking over their shoulders at what was unfolding contemporaneously in Florida, for example, where you probably had the highest stage of cooperation between the indigenous and the Africans with the so-called Seminole Wars. A series of wars were some of the most bloody that the settler regime was involved in before the Civil War, circa 1818 to 1821, the 1830s, and then the 1850s, for example. And then preceding that, of course, you have another traumatic episode for the settlers. And like many traumatic episodes, the settlers and their descendants find it difficult to discuss, even to this very day. Although, of course, psychologically, it can be manifested even when not discussed, as any psychiatrist could tell you. I'm speaking, for example, of the War of 1812, August 1814, when the enslaved population of Washington, D.C. Joined the invaders. I already mentioned Tecumseh's role with regard to this conflict in routing President Madison and his guerrilla spouse Dolly, sending them fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse, torching the White House, torching a good deal of Washington, and then fleeing, that is to say, the enslaved on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continued to reside, for example. And so my own estimation is that you cannot begin to understand, for example, police terror against Black populations that have produced George Floyd, that we saw captured on videotape in Los Angeles in the early 1990s with the Black motorist Rodney King being flayed from pillar to post by officers of the law. The names too numerous to mention, Sandra Bland in Southeast Texas, for example. The disproportionate sighting on death row, the fact that infant mortality rates in the Black community are much higher than in other demographics, you cannot begin to understand this severe oppression and repression without understanding that this is the price that you pay when you are not only intended to be a cheap or even free form of labor to develop a capitalist society. I'm speaking of the enslaved population who on the verge of the U.S. Civil War, 1860, 1861, were probably the most valuable investment on these shores, more valuable than the railroads, for example, that you cannot begin to understand the kind of that intensity of persecution without understanding the fierce resistance to being free labor and then cheap labor, and that this encompasses many challenges. In fact, as I say in one of my recent books, part of the problem with the United States right now is that you have an enslaved population and their descendants, which have been enmeshed in class struggle, everything from malingering to armed revolt against the settlers and the settler state. Whereas settler colonialism itself, as already noted, is a class collaborationist project. And so it's mixing oil and water when you try to combine under one umbrella a community enmeshed in class struggle with a community whose ethos is class collaboration. And there's been a tension and a back and forth with regard to which force will prevail. Now, of course, we were able to line up our ducks in a row and prevail in the US Civil War for various reasons we can go into if you want. We were able to prevail in helping to erode the more egregious and harsh aspects of Jim Crow in the last 75 years. But oftentimes those victories came with international support. And part of the price of the retreat from Jim Crow, which is how I got involved in writing history in the first instance, came from throwing overboard the Black internationalists, for example, like Paul Robeson, to cite one example amongst many. And that obviously has compromised our struggle in the 21st century, particularly since in this class collaborationist project, we need international solidarity, but we help to make radioactive the internationalists, which is one of the reasons why we're suffering so grievously. But at the same time, I don't want to paint a picture of gloom and doom because, as I told an audience the other day, based upon my most recent book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, Washington, D.C. was the capital of slavery, and that whole Baltimore-Washington corridor at the same time was a vector of anti-slavery and abolitionism, for example. And likewise, as I survey the landscape, I see that Baltimore-Washington corridor emerging in the 21st century as the capital of anti-fascism. And that is something to both study and celebrate.
Mm-hmm. I think this discussion of the resistance of exploited populations, I feel it's worth putting a finer point on, particularly when it comes to Texas. I just got finished reading the Counterrevolution of Texas book, and what features prominently is this sort of, as you were describing, a traumatic memory in slaveholders in general, but particularly those in Texas who were confronted with indigenous populations or with resistive indigenous populations and fleeing and revolting slave populations. But the traumatic memories of like the Nat Turner Rebellion, constant reference to San Domingo or Haiti, and how these often unsuccessful but still very traumatic instances of rebellion and resistance from these exploited classes and populations almost inflamed further like more violent white supremacy, and even was the seeds for, in a sense, for a reactionary response and creating a sort of fascistic state within Texas. So I just wanted to, if you could talk about Texas in particular and um, their constant existential dread when it comes to revolting slave populations and the indigenous and even the antagonistic Mexico and abolitionist opponents, and how white supremacy deals with threats and why it seems to become more violent.
Mm. Well, first of all, I'm speaking to you now from Texas, and as a cautionary note, and actually a counsel to those of you who are not behind the cotton curtain, as I am now, that the way things are evolving, uh, those of you on the other side of the cotton curtain are going to have to lend more assistance and solidarity to those of us who are on this side of the cotton curtain. Uh, I'll just leave it as that because things here are, are really getting extreme. And I'm not sure if even the press, even the New York Times and Washington Post and the LA Times and Wall Street Journal, I'm sure if they have a handle on this. But in any case, with regard to Texas, uh, as some in your audience may know, the founding fathers of the Republic of Texas, which was in existence from 1836 to 1845, they seceded from Mexico, not least because Mexico, under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, seemed to be on the path towards abolitionism. Now, of course, Mexico City was able to carve out an exception for Texas slavery, but just like with Somerset's case in 1772, where London seemed to be on the path to abolition, they were not necessarily extending that decision across the Atlantic to jeopardize the fortunes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. But being canny investors, they saw the writing on the wall. At least they thought they saw the writing on the wall. And therefore, combined with the Royal Proclamation line of 1762, 1763, where London had expressed displeasure in terms of continuing to expend blood and treasure, uprooting the indigenous so that real estate speculators like George Washington could profit. You had a similar dynamic in Tejas or Texas in the 1830s. And of course, they saw themselves understandably and justifiably as walking the footsteps of Washington, Madison, Jefferson, etc. Interestingly enough, despite that emulation, the Republic of Texas, in some ways, saw itself as a challenger to the United States of America. As I tell the story, I think that's one of the reasons why, at the same time you had the Republic of Texas emerging, you had the decision in Washington to establish a so-called Bantustan on Texas's northern border, speaking of Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, where you have the expulsion of the indigenous from the southeast quadrant of what is now the United States, including the Cherokees, who, of course, many of whom were slave owners. They're established right there on the northern border. In some ways, it's as a check, in my estimation, against the pretensions of Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, and the other founding fathers of the so-called Republic of Texas. And of course, the Republic of Texas, during its brief reign, was not necessarily ensnared by U.S. admonitions against participation in the African slave trade. And of course, U.S. nationals were not necessarily ensnared by those prohibitions either. And so you could find the Lone Star flag off the coast of Angola, off the coast of Brazil, off the coast of Cuba. Galveston, Texas, a major slave importing venue, for example. But alas, the Republic of Texas was not able to withstand the challenge from British abolitionists and their comrades in Haiti, and therefore crawled into the Union circa 1845, but then was able to influence Washington to a degree. As in 1846, you had the War of Aggression against Mexico, the ultimate revenge against the tormentors of the Texas slave owners. And Washington walks away with, of course, California, now by some measures, the fourth or fifth largest economy on planet Earth. And we should not see it as coincidental, to go back to my earlier point about this war against the Spanish-speaking world of 2025, that the three most populous and richest states, California, Texas, Florida, all used to be under the jurisdiction of His Catholic Majesty in Spain. Interestingly enough, too, there's another aspect of the story that I only hint at in the Texas Book of 1836, but I'll explore further in this book on, on the Pacific Northwest, because at the same time, you have the rise of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which, interestingly enough, like many Negroes who were fleeing westward because they thought they were escaping U.S. jurisdiction, you had the same thing with the people we oftentimes refer to as the Mormons or LDS. And that, of course, then brought them into sharp conflict with the United States. Your audience may want to look at the Mountain Meadow Massacre, circa 1857, uh, where there is massacring of settlers from the United States crossing the plains, going through LDS territory in Utah, for example. And in fact, just as the US charged that the Hudson Bay Company was involved in arming the indigenous to harass and plunder the settlers, they also charged LDS with arming the indigenous and being too soft on the indigenous as well. And of course, as things tend to happen, you've had a certain evolution of LDS in the 21st century. They're now viewed as a bastion of conservatism because of their missionizing. They oftentimes fluent in different languages. Of course, the LDS candidate for president, Mitt Romney, spoke fluent French, although he kept that hidden when he ran against Obama because France wasn't very popular at the time. And so you see LDS congregants festoon oftentimes at the highest levels of the Central Intelligence Agency, for example, because of their fluency with languages.
So-called Mormon clique.
Right. I mean, that's how, you know, that's why we study history, because things can evolve, things can change for various reasons. But in any case, this is part of this tortured history of the United States of America that we're beginning to grapple with, but which I'm confident that will be able to absorb the lessons and ultimately overcome.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you our last questions. I know that we're running short on time. Even in your last answer, you talked about how, there is this absorbing of, the outpost being incorporated, Texas, at one point being the frontier or the outpost or the enemy, and then it incorporated. Um, and I wanted to ask you about the end of the frontier, that like what happens when settler colonialism reaches, its endpoint. And can it reach into the endpoint? Like, does the U.S. still operate as a settler colony? Is that still a fair thing to call the U.S.? Like, or does that end when, we sort of reach the coast, when we connect the coasts, so to speak, and um, how does settler colonialism, figure into American politics today, especially with the US's role beyond settler colonialism as this global capitalist neo-empire? Does that negate its settler colonial origins, or like how are these things, you know, what happens when we reach the end of settler colonialism? Can we reach the end of it?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because the plot is unfolding as we speak. And that's one of the reasons why we not only need to study history, we need to study carefully contemporary events, what's unfolding today. I mean, for example, we mentioned briefly in passing what may be an impending attack on Venezuela. Who knows how that will eventuate, for example. Simultaneously, you have the expulsion of tens of thousands of anti-regime Venezuelans, particularly from Florida. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just the other day about how this is negatively impacting the real estate market of South Florida because Venezuelans are just leaving, abandoning their leases, abandoning their mortgages. Some are headed to Spain, and actually that's part of the conflict with Spain right now, in the sense that they're not as hostile to migration as their EU counterparts. And then, of course, they have a higher economic growth rate than their EU partners as well, perhaps as a partial result. And so some of them are returning to Venezuela, where they can become an advance guard for an invasion of Caracas, for example. Who knows how that story will eventuate? Who knows what impact that will have on the Cuban Revolution, for example, given the pretensions of Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his Cuban roots, for example. So it's difficult to, at this precise moment, to project and predict the trajectory of settler colonialism, because there might be future chapters. Or on the other hand, that whole story might be coming to a shattering close, for example, because of the strength of progressive forces, the strength of anti-fascist forces, the strength of radical forces, for example. I prefer to think that option number two is what is going to prevail. But sadly, I've been wrong before.
Yeah. But I like the revolutionary optimism that just because we experience these conditions and these contradictions, and just because we are opposing these forces, that does not mean that the conditions for revolution are not there. I particularly take hope from the South Africans and their struggle against apartheid, that the settler colonialism can be fought in the modern day, and that we can, you know that we can be
Under very
victorious.
difficult and adverse conditions, as the South African example suggests. I mean, in terms, I like to quote this story because I think it suggests that you should take what I'm saying with a shaker of salt. In early June 1989, I was in East Berlin, and I recall picking up the newspaper and reading about the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. And of course, I leaped to the conclusion, oh, it's all over for the Chinese Communist Party, which was obviously an incorrect conclusion. And of course, what I should have been looking at, what was going on in East Berlin, and what was to unfold a few months later with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But that all went over my head. So that's just a cautionary note with regard to some of my powers of prognostication.
Yeah, prediction's always a losing game, but I agree with Nick, and I agree with you in an optimistic outlook. I mean, the more challenging things become and the more exploitative and fascistic things come, I think that you can be equally assured of resistance to that. And we're definitely seeing more and more of that as more and more right wing and fascist vectors are rearing their head. But we do appreciate your time, Dr. Horne. We really do, and appreciate your thoughtful answers to our questions. If you have anything else to add, Nick.
Yeah, this was an honor and a pleasure, and that we would love to have you back on
Oh yes,
in the future. I'd love to read your upcoming book. If you want to shout out your upcoming book, what will be its title? Have you?
Okay, well, I have a number of books I'm working on. I always like to talk about stuff that hasn't come out yet for whatever reason. So in a few months, there will be the Counterrevolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asia-Pacific basin. And then I'm doing a book on North Africa, East Africa. For example, post-U.S. Civil War, many of the Confederate leaders migrate to Cairo, where they then lead invasions of Ethiopia. And that will start off the book on Northern and Eastern Africa. And then there's the book that I kept referring to on the Pacific Northwest, the Canadian Southwest, to not descend into chauvinism. Comparative settler colonialism, the U.S. and Canada, slavery, and indigenous dispossession. And I think I gave a hint of where that book is going in my previous remarks. And I'm doing a book on Mississippi slavery, which is only in its embryonic form. My roots are in Mississippi, for example. The heart of darkness when it comes to slavery and Jim Crow in North America. And then, as my last comment suggested, I'm doing a book on China. Because we all have to explain how did this happen, where this white supremacist state helps to boost into the passing lane an Asian nation, the most populous, well, until recently, the most populous of nations. And this anti-communist nation helped to boost into prominence the largest communist party on planet Earth with 100 million members. So I have so much to say about that project because I've been working on it quite a bit. And it's quite a story. I mean, Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, he played upon the fears and trauma of the imperialists like a drum. I mean, I was just in Carter Library just a few days ago. And so this is in late 1978, just before full relations were established. And so Brzezinski, the national security advisor, had written a memo for President Carter, where the Chinese leaders had assured him that the conflict with Moscow would last for 10,000 years. And Carter had underlined 10,000 years. And I can imagine him saying, oh, we're good.
Right.
But it turned out, as my friend just said, sometimes predictions don't work out.
That's right. That's right. We would I'm sure Nick agrees. We would love to have you on for an interview on that book. Nick in particular is a China head.
Oh,
So
really? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to oversell. You could speak for yourself, Nick, but we definitely appreciate a good getting into the weeds on something like that. So
Right on.
I won't keep you long with it, but yeah, I had family that lived in China for a number of years, and I've been multiple times. And
Oh, what part?
so Shanghai and then Nanjing.
Is that right?
During the 2008 crisis, they lived in Detroit. They were in the auto industry, and they moved to China to be a part of the Chinese auto industry.
Is that well? Leonard Woodcock was the first U.S. ambassador to China, formerly president of the United Auto Workers.
oh,
Wow, interesting. I did not know that.
I mean, he's going to be one of my main characters. I mean, he's one of the people who shepherded the movement of industrial plants across the Pacific. The former leader of the United Auto Workers.
sure. Sure. Very cool. Very cool.
Well,
Yeah,
we should wrap up. It was such a pleasure. We will definitely be reaching out in the future. I hope you have a nice rest of your week and weekend.
Yeah, ditto. And send me the link when it's up.
Yes, 100%.
absolutely.
All right, I'll sign off. Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye.
take care.